Did Milton Friedman predict the Roaring Kitty? Is socialism only possible with capitalism, or can it exist outside of capitalism? Milton Friedman tackles these kind of questions in Capitalism and Freedom. And I'm going to go ahead and go through a bunch of highlights and tabs briefly, and we're going to dive deep. I've had a lot of fun going over books, and we're just going to dive into my tabs and my highlights and just kind of talk about, starting out with chapter one, the relation between economic freedom and political freedom. The first highlight I made on page 13 was clearly economic freedom in and of itself is an extremely important part of total freedom. Freedom is something that I just kind of talked about on my blog, and giving up freedom for money is something that happens today. Fame as well. So check that out, manictulip76.com. Because we live in a largely free society, we tend to forget how limited is the span of time in the part of the globe for which there has ever been anything like political freedom. The typical state of mankind is tyranny, servitude, and misery. He goes on to illustrate the 19th and the 20th centuries, history between World War I and World War II, talks about Greece, and this is a statement that largely we can agree with, especially anyone who has taken history. We know that the past is particularly brutal for humankind as a whole. Okay, page 14. Laissez-faire is an economic term for, I guess, French for let it be. An enormous increase in the well-being of the masses followed this change in economic arrangement. So this is philosophical radicals. Anyway, so like he's basically saying when laissez-faire became a theory, it was good. All right, page 16. Bad and good people may be the same people depending on who is judging them. This quote taken out of context still is very good, because just because you did something bad when you were younger doesn't mean you're still a bad person, right? And just because you're a good person doesn't mean you can't do bad things. And so I think that's just a great quote. Okay, page 17. A working model of the society organized through voluntary exchange is a free private enterprise exchange economy, which is what we have been calling competitive capitalism. He goes on to illustrate that in the simplest form, such a society consists of a number of independent households, a collection of Robinson Crusoes, as it were. A great book if you haven't read it. Each household uses its resources it controls to produce goods and services that it exchanges for goods and services produced by other households. I'm skipping a lot. I do recommend this book. Page 19. So as long as effective freedom of exchange is maintained, the central feature of the market organization of economic activity is that it prevents one person from interfering with another in respect of most of his activities. The consumer is protected from coercion by the seller because of the presence of other sellers with whom he can deal. So the consumer is protected from coercion by the seller because of the presence of other sellers with whom he can deal. The seller is protected from coercion by the consumer because of other consumers to which he can sell. The employee is protected from coercion by the employer because of other employers that he can go to work for. The market does this impersonally and without centralized authority, which is the key argument that we're going to kind of see throughout the book, is that it's not discriminatory, it's impersonal. The fundamental threat to freedom is power to coerce, he says on page 20. But it is far more difficult to maintain numerous equipotent small centers of political power in a single large government than it is to have numerous centers of economic strength in a single large economy. All right, he didn't have Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies at the time, but wonder how the alternate currencies that we have in today's day and age would really affect this paragraph. If the central government gains power, it is likely to be at the expense of local governments. So this is why I personally think you need to focus more on the local level, what's going on in your local community with your local government first and foremost to affect change. We'll see that theme a little bit later on in the book as well, about what's doing best for you and your family. It is a mark of the political freedom, and I love this, of a capitalist society that men can openly advocate and work for socialism. Equally, political freedom in a socialist society would require that men be free to advocate the introduction of capitalism. In order for men to advocate anything, they must, in first place, be able to earn a living. He says this already raises a problem in socialist society. We're going to go to page 22, see how maybe did he predict Roaring Kitty. Essentially, the role of inequality in wealth and preserving political freedom that is seldom noted is the role of patron. The role of the patron is very important because of what people can do once they achieve billions. They are now paid. So this is interesting. In a capitalist society, it is only necessary to convince a few wealthy people to get funds to launch any idea, however strange, and there are many such persons, many independent foci of support, VCs, right? And indeed, it is not even necessary to persuade people or financial institutions with available funds of the soundness of ideas to be propagated. It's only necessary to persuade them that the propagation can be financially successful, that the newspaper, magazine, or book or other venture will be profitable. Competitive publisher, for example, cannot afford to publish only writing with which he personally agrees. His touchstone must be the likelihood that the market will be large enough to yield a satisfactory return on his investment. And getting to Roaring Kitty, but I wonder if he could ever have predicted the level of influencers that we have and echo chambers that exist in the internet today. But in this way, the market breaks the vicious circle and makes it possible ultimately to finance such ventures, i.e., GameStop, by small amounts from many people without first persuading them. There are no such possibilities in a socialist society, he goes on to say. There's only the all powerful state. I think that this just goes to show like the exposure of hedge funds that happened in 2021, that it also goes to illustrate this principle that I was just talking about in another episode of Stand Tall, and we actually did just cover it. So chapter 7 in How to Win People to Your Way of Thinking is let the other person feel that the idea is his or hers. And so we saw this right with Roaring Kitty, where he essentially released all this information, his research, to the world and let us like kind of make the decision ourselves. And it was that belief which led to we're breaking the vicious circle. On the contrary, no society could be stable if advocacy of radical change were costless, much less subsidized. It is entirely appropriate that men make sacrifices to advocate for causes for which they deeply believe. Right? Again, the role of the patron. What causes do they deeply believe? One may believe, as I do, Friedman writes, that communism would destroy all of our freedoms. One may be opposed to it as firmly and as strongly as possible, and yet at the same time also believe that in a free society it is intolerable for a man to be prevented from making voluntary arrangements for which others that are mutually attractive because he believes in or is trying to promote communism. His freedom includes the freedom to promote communism. Freedom also, of course, includes the freedom of others not to deal with him under those circumstances. There's an interesting adjacent story about the Hollywood blacklist in the 1970s. Trumbo, which I know there is a documentary about out now with Bryan Cranston as the actor. I've not watched it, but I'm sure it's great. And then he wraps up the relation between economic freedom and political freedom with, yet paradoxically enough, the enemies of the free market, the socialists and communists, have been recruited in disproportionate measure from these groups. Instead of recognizing that the existence of the market has protected them from the attitudes of their fellow countrymen, they mistakenly attribute the residual discrimination to the market. He sets that up in order to tear it down in the following chapters. Chapter 2, The Role of Government in a Free Society. Page 30, fundamental differences in basic values can seldom, if ever, be resolved at the ballot box. Ultimately, they can only be decided, they're not resolved by conflict. He talks about the Civil War, of course, is one of the reasons, and I think maybe the sting is a little bit more relevant at the time of writing, but I do think that conflict can be resolved without fighting. But again, that's not quite what he said. So, government as a rule maker and umpire, I have highlighted in both games and society also, no set of rules can prevail unless most participants most of the time conform to them without external sanction, unless that is there's a broad underlying social consensus. Then these are the basic rules of government in a free society. Provide a means whereby we can modify the rules, to mediate differences among us on the meaning of the rules, and to enforce compliance with the rules on the part of those who would otherwise not play the game. The need for government in these respects arises because absolute freedom is impossible. However attractive anarchy may be as a philosophy, it is not feasible in a world of imperfect men. And there's a nice little bow tie on that. Okay, so action through government on grounds of technical monopoly and neighborhood effects. The title of one of the sections coming up. It's a little bit of a deep dive into what the neighborhood effect is, government action, and things like that. And so as he dives deeper, action through government on paternalistic grounds is where we get into one of my favorite economic concepts of the ultimate operative unit in our society, this is a direct quote, is the family, not the individual. The reason the family unit is the strongest force in economic society, this is coming from another economic book, an explanation, is essentially that it is the heaviest like economic impact of expenditure, because, and we can see this through marketing, the parents are willing to do whatever to provide the greatest life for their children, and that's relevant in many ways. And so whether it's feeding our kids healthier food, buying a whole house water filter system, sending them to private school, which he talks about, and all of these decisions, they are economic multipliers in the sense of when you're purchasing a car and you have a little one or little ones, you're going to go for the bigger, bulkier, chunkier, $10,000 more than the car that you would get if it was just you and a significant other, right? More responsibility on buying on behalf of the family unit. And so it's a heavy impact on the economy as a whole. The deep dive that I would love to take one day is how, of course, the socialist communist agenda would want to drive a wedge in that. He concludes the role of government in a free society, which takes us to chapter 3, the control of money. And I'm just going to read the first few sentences to kind of lay the foundation for what we're about to talk about, and kind of see the string of where he's taking this book and what he's going to, to lay out argumentative wise and what to do. So, full employment and economic growth have in the past few decades become primary excuses for widening the extent of government intervention in economic affairs. And as we move through this, I always love the history adjacent lessons of what's being repeated, what's echoing the past, as far as boom and bust cycles. A private free enterprise economy, it is said, is inherently unstable. Left to itself, it will produce recurrent cycles of boom and bust. The government must therefore step in to keep things on an even keel. These arguments were particularly potent during and after the Great Depression, and they were a major element in giving rise to the New Deal. More recently, economic growth has become the more popular rallying call. Government must, it is argued, see to it that the economy expands to provide the wherewithal for the Cold War and demonstrate to the uncommitted nations of the world that a democracy can grow more rapidly than a communist state. These arguments are thoroughly misleading. He goes on to say, basically, that the Great Depression and other periods of severe unemployment are caused by government mismanagement rather than any inherent instability in a private economy. A government agency established the Federal Reserve System, and it had been given the responsibility of monetary policy. So he dives into that a little bit, gives a little history lesson, mentions some dates. Our task in this and the following chapter is to steer a course between two views, neither of which is acceptable, though both have their attractions. And so I like that he's at least saying this. He's saying these are the two ways to approach this, and we need to understand that neither one of them is ideal, but there's got to be something that we can all agree to. And it's just so weird to me that, like, why is the WEF, why do they consider Milton Friedman a liberal, a radical economist? These are questions that we're diving into these books to find out what's so radical. A discretionary monetary authority. So we skipped a couple of pages. He's talking about all the stuff that you need to know about the Federal Reserve and fractional reserve currency system and kind of setting it up. So really, really, technical stuff. So pick up a copy. It's a great book. You're going to love all the history around World War One. It's great. Okay. So he goes to say on page 55 in a discretionary monetary authority part of the control of money, I am myself persuaded a third of the price rise during and just after World War I is attributable to the establishment of the Federal Reserve System and would not have occurred if the earlier banking system had been retained. So this is what he believes. He cites his sources here at the bottom: A Program for Monetary Stability by Friedman and Anna J. Schwartz, Monetary History of the United States from 1867 to 1960, Princeton University Press, and National Bureau of Economic Research. So that is basically what he references. He says, like, here is my research document. You can go check it out to back up why I feel this way. He wraps up with 1930, the December 11th failure of the Bank of the United States. It was a critical moment in the Great Depression because it was not only one of the largest in the country with over 200 million in deposits, but the name led many people both at home and abroad to regard it as somehow an official bank. So that kind of gave the U.S. like a like, oh, things aren't so great. So that's what caused the market to do what it did, and many other reasons. Okay. In a fractional reserve banking system like ours, a bank does not, of course, have a dollar of currency or its equivalent for a dollar of deposits. That is why deposits is such a misleading term. I think it's important to understand the fractional reserve currency system because, like, if there is a run on the bank, nobody's going to be able to get money out of the bank because of this, right? The 7-to-1. All right, we're diving in and starting to get a little bit deeper in because, like, this is like the thick meat of his argument. As we have seen, one of the major reasons for establishing the Federal Reserve System was to deal with such a situation. It was given the power to create more cash if a widespread demand should arise on the part of the public for currency instead of deposits, and was given the means to make the cash available to banks on the security of the bank's assets. In this way, it was expected that any threatened panic could be averted, but then there would be no need for suspension of convertibility of deposits into currency, and that the depressing effects of the monetary crisis could be entirely avoided. We saw this in COVID. We see this in wartime. The first need for these powers, and hence the first test there, came in 1930. It did nothing to provide the banking system with liquidity. It is worth emphasizing, he writes, that the system's failure was a failure of will and not power. And I love that he wraps his paragraph up with, on this occasion, as on the later ones that followed, the system, the Federal Reserve System, had ample power to provide the banks with the cash their depositors were demanding. Had this been done, the bank closings would have been cut short and the monetary debacle averted. So is that why every time there's a bailout, we just print ourselves out of the crisis? Is that why whenever there's wartime spending, we just print ourselves out of it? Why was '08 different? Because of who was at the helm, right? Henry Paulson. Because what did that mean for us? And now who's at the helm, right? We've got Jerome Powell. And he even pokes fun at like a kind of cult of personality behind the Federal Reserve System. And it's kind of funny. I recommend reading it. And anyway, and the dove is yelling, right? So the Federal Reserve System took advantage of the opportunity to reduce its own credit outstanding, which is to say, and I put this in quote, it offset the naturally expansionary forces by engaging in mild deflationary action, in quote. Even so, there were clear signs of improvement not only in the monetary sector, but also in other economic activities. If you examine the first 4 to 5 months of 1931 without reference to what actually followed, you had all the earmarks at the bottom of the cycle. So this is why it's important when you are investing, when you are putting together your long-term portfolio, that you make sure that you don't isolate time periods. And past performance is not indicative of future results. And we'll start to peel back on that, and you definitely get more of a sense for it if you read George Soros's Alchemy of Finance and his book about open society. Great recommendations for the investor. Yet so great is the capacity for self-justification, and I love this part, that the Federal Reserve Board could write in its annual report for 1933, and he quotes, the ability of the Federal Reserve banks to meet enormous demands for currency during the crisis demonstrated the effectiveness of the country's currency system under the Federal Reserve Act. It is difficult to say what the course of depression would have been had the Federal Reserve System not pursued a policy of liberal open market purchases. He goes on to say, all told, from 1929 to 1933, the money stock in the U.S. fell by 1/3. 2/3 of the decline came after England's departure from the gold standard. He says if money stock just kept declining, as it clearly could and should have done, contraction could have been both shorter and milder. It might have been relatively severe by historical standards, but it is literally inconceivable that money income could have declined by over 1/2 and prices by over 1/3 in the course of 4 years if there had no been decline in the stock of money. This part is like triple highlighted for me. I know of no severe depression in any country or any time that was not accompanied by a sharp decline in the stock of money, and equally of no sharp decline in the stock of money that was not accompanied by a severe depression. He's saying they're interchangeable, they're yin and yang, they're flip-floppable. Correlation does equal causation. But is that cited and cliff noted? No. That is his anecdotal opinion. The Great Depression in the U.S. is far from being a sign of the inherent instability of the private enterprise system. It is a testament to how much harm can be done by mistakes on the part of a few men when they wield vast power over the monetary system of a country. Friedman writes. He says this is the key political argument against an independent central bank, but it is a bad system even to those who set security higher than freedom. It is a bad system even to those who set security higher than freedom. Mistakes, excusable or not, cannot be avoided in a system which disperses responsibility, yet gives a few men great power, and which thereby makes important policy actions highly dependent on accidents of personality, right? Accidents of personality, W. Yellen, J. Powell, like all of this stuff that we see in today's influencer culture. This is the key technical argument against an independent bank. To paraphrase Clemenceau, money is much too serious a matter to be left to central bankers. Rules instead of authorities is the next portion of the chapter. Okay, the authority can always do of its own volition what the rule would require it to do. Later, I highlighted, surely it will also be willing to legislate the right policy in each specific case. How then, it is said, does the adoption of the rule provide any protection against irresponsible political action? One man wants to stand up on a street corner and advocate birth control, another communism, a third vegetarianism, and so on ad infinitum. Why not enact a law affirming or denying to each right to spread his particular views? Or alternatively, why not give the power to decide the issue to an administrative agency? It is immediately clear, and this is important, and think about the mask policy. It is immediately clear that if we were to take each case up as it came, a majority would almost surely vote to deny free speech in most cases, and perhaps even in every case taken separately. A vote on whether Mr. X should spread birth control propaganda would almost surely yield a majority saying no, and so would one on communism. The vegetarian might perhaps get by, though that is by no means a foregone conclusion. Later, I highlighted why. One reason is that each person feels much more strongly about being deprived of his right to free speech when he is in the minority than when he feels about depriving somebody else of the right to free speech when he is in the majority. Who's trying to convince you who the majority is? Read the Art of War, then you'll have your answers for the path ahead. All right. And the like will all be hampered in a great variety of ways that are obvious to all. Decision makers are examining only a limited area and not taking into account the cumulative consequences of the policy as a whole. The generally liberal persuasion is a price level rule, namely a legislative directive to the monetary authorities that they maintain a stable price level. I think this is the wrong kind of rule. Friedman writes, it is the wrong kind of rule because it is in terms of objectives that the monetary authorities do not have the clear and direct power to achieve by their own actions. He wraps up this page with, my choice at the moment would be a legislative rule instructing the monetary authority to achieve a specified rate of growth in the stock of money. So it's like we're controlling the rate of growth. We're going to tell people what that rate of growth is. This is what we want to achieve with that rate of growth. Concluding with, such a rule seems to me only feasible device currently available for converting monetary policy into a pillar of free society rather than a threat to its foundations, which we are at that precipice. All you got to do, figure that one out, is take a look at this book by Ray Dalio. There's other books, The Fourth Turning. We are in times of immense change, and we're going to dive into that a little bit more as we move forward as far as the Industrial Revolution and its echoes into the AI revolution that we're in right now. So stay with me. Chapter 4, International Financial and Trade Arrangements. The first thing I have highlighted is there's much experience to suggest that the most effective way to convert a market economy into an authoritarian economic society is to start by imposing direct controls on foreign exchange. I just want to point out that this is something that Trump does. So do we want to be, I don't want to say a mercantile nation, a mercantilist nation, but authoritarian economic society? This is like rationing imports, producing substitutes, and it's a never-ending spiral. He writes that this cure would be vastly worse than the disease. He references the Nazis in the Civil War, inconvertible U.S. currency, and coin for bullion, and just kind of a little bit of a dip into the gold, which lays the foundation for the role of gold in the U.S. monetary system on page 71. I'm not really going into it. Okay, this is just a touchy subject for anybody. Gold. One can hardly imagine a measure more destructive of the principles of private property on which a free enterprise society rests. There's no difference between this nationalization of gold at an artificially low price and Fidel Castro's nationalization of land and factories at an artificially low price. On what grounds of principle can the U.S. object to the one after having itself engaged in the other? Yeah, he talks about J.P. Morgan a little bit in here. Paper profit, the abrogation of the gold clauses had a similar purpose. And this too was measure of destructive of basic principles of free enterprise. And so we kind of get into the muck of like the transition from like the gold backed currency into the fiat currency. And it's just like there's just I didn't highlight a lot in this part because it's just kind of deep and heavy and factual. So that's why it's an important read, but hard to explain. He says in international financial and trade arrangements, there are four and only four ways in which a country can adjust to such a disturbance, and some combination of these ways can be used. So, like if foreign payments are out of balance, I guess the balance sheet. So, U.S. reserves of foreign currencies can be drawn down for foreign reserves of U.S. currency built up, right? In practice, this means that the U.S. government can let its stock of gold go down, and he dives into it. Domestic prices within the U.S. can be forced down relative to foreign prices. This is the main adjustment mechanism under a full-fledged gold standard. Exactly the same effects can be achieved by change in exchange rates as by change in domestic prices. He goes into some math. Yeah, and he just does some illustrations with numbers. The adjustments produced by mechanisms 2 and 3 consist, and this is number 4, consist of changes in flows of commodities and services induced by changes either internal prices or exchange rates. And he just kind of ties it up with instead direct governmental controls of or interferences with trade could be used to reduce attempted U.S. expenditures of dollar and expand U.S. receipts. Tariffs can be raised to choke off imports. Subsidies could be given to stimulate exports. Import quotas could be imposed on a variety of goods. Capital investment abroad by U.S. citizens or foreign or firms could be controlled, and so on, and up to the whole paraphernalia of exchange controls. Okay, so like all of these little levers and buttons and dials and things to just manipulate the economy. Recipients, and this I think is important because of Ukraine, recipients of foreign aid and all of the wars that we finance may be required to spend the aid in the U.S. The military may procure goods in the U.S. at greater expense instead of abroad in order to save dollars, right? The self-contradictory terminology used, and so on, in a bewildering array. And I think that even though like he's proposing these as a way to balance the foreign import export balance sheet, maybe, is that this happens with Halliburton, Lockheed, Boeing, military defense spender contractors. You know, we have these pre-selected entities in which governmental contract money gets moved into and funneled to, and in that way, the government, through private enterprise, manipulates certain outcomes. And the important thing is to kind of what like who is behind that, who is which governments are behind these, and why. Mainly oil. Floating exchange rates and the free market solution, I didn't highlight anything. Policy measures necessary for a free market in gold and foreign exchange, again I didn't highlight anything. Eliminating U.S. restrictions on trade, this he talks about Japan and the U.S. and goes into some yen to dollar import export examples. It's all very deep, mathy and heavy, and really is just an illustration that you just have to read through numbers. And it's a beautiful thing, but it's also kind of, in my opinion, a little irrelevant given the cryptocurrency revolution and things that are happening now. You know, these are things that he may not, Friedman may not have been able to anticipate. Chapter 5, Fiscal Policy. Ever since the New Deal, and I have this as like the first thing highlighted, a primary excuse for the expansion of governmental activity at the federal level has been the supposed necessity for government spending to eliminate unemployment. This excuse, Friedman writes, has gone through several stages. At first, government spending was needed to prime the pump. You'll hear this from, from historians, and yeah, you'll know. If you've been paying attention since you've been a little kid, you'll know that one. Temporary expenditures would set the economy going, and the government could then step out of the picture. When the initial expenditures failed to eliminate unemployment and were followed by a sharp economic contraction, the theory of secular stagnation developed to justify a permanently high level of government spending. The economy had become mature, it was argued. This is from 1937 to 38. We're in late stage capitalism now, you'll hear people say. And he dives in about government expenditures and just kind of like why they got put in place, why they're in place. I highlighted on the next page, it is ironic that the most unstable component of national income in the post-war period is federal expenditure. right? What he's saying is during most post-war periods, and we saw this repeat itself with the COVID wartime spending, is that it's ironic that it's like that's the national, like that's how it's just like perceived, and it's like, well, the only way that we're gonna like get out of this is just to like spend more money within ourselves by printing more money, and then you see the cycle repeat enough times, and you're like, what's going on here? Far from being a balance wheel offsetting other forces making for fluctuations, the federal budget has, if anything, been itself a major source of disturbance and instability, right? Because if you're just going to throw a crap ton of money at something, you're going to get some outcome, and it may not be good or bad. 96. And even if money income increases, prices may rise, so real income will increase less or not at all. And then he says, let us examine some of the possible slips twixt cup and lip. And so, what essentially he goes on to mean is the final result is much more dubious. There's no change in income at all. Private expenditures may go down a little bit, government expenditures go up, but like there's no accounting for what the government spends the money on. And then basically all the stuff that we try to do to impose minimum wage laws and give people raises and grow the economy, only if imposed and incentivized by the government, it tends to actually not help. But also because of the Federal Reserve banking system, it's like not helping. And so where the government gets the money to spend. So far as the analysis goes, the results are the same whether the government prints extra money or borrows from the public, so far as this analysis goes. But so, like, why are they taxing us when they're just printing their own money? This is what he's saying here. He's just asking that question. Private expenditures versus government expenditures, yada, yada, yada. He wraps up the chapter with this means that a rise in government expenditures relative to income is not expansionary in any relevant sense. It may add money income, but all of a sudden it's absorbed by the government expenditures. So it's like we just pumped a bunch of money into what? The conclusions cannot, of course, be regarded as final. He ties a bow on this. One thing is, however, clear: whether the views so widely accepted about the effects of fiscal policy be right or wrong, they are contradicted by at least one extensive body of evidence. I know of no other coherent or organized body of evidence justifying them. They are part of economic mythology, not to be demonstrated conclusions of economic analysis or quantitative studies. Yet they have wielded immense influence in securing widespread public backing for far reaching governmental interference in economic life. Like, mic drop. Love it. Chapter 6: The Role of Government in Education. And I would love to hear your comments about what you think about Milton Friedman's proposed idea for education. So I have this tabbed but not highlighted, and this is essentially why education is important, right? Because to avoid the tragedy of the commons in many ways, education can contribute to widespread acceptance of some common set of values. The gain from the education of a child accrues not only to the child or to the parents, but also to the other members of society. Okay, so this is important. This is why the education of our children, my child, your child, contributes to the welfare by promoting a stable and democratic society. It is not feasible to identify the particular individuals or families benefited, and so to charge for services rendered, like you can't. There's no, because everybody benefits the more educated the population. There's therefore a significant neighborhood effect. So this like tidbit of information alone, it's just so important because it's real substantive, factual, actionable data that we can do something with, knowing that education is so important. And then we look at why has the education system been failing? Has it been our government? No, it turns out it's not our government's fault. We have been bought on the open market, and our politicians are bought and paid for by foreign influencers. When you find out about, or if you at least look at it through the lens of if education is failed so much, especially in the public school system, whether it's true or not, because I don't audit public schools myself, this is just all, hearsay. But you do that and you tie it into the art of war, and you realize that that's a military tactic being used against us, the very citizens of this nation. So the military, as I skip through the schooling segment to get to the meat of it, needs to be checked, right? Because the military is the arm of government in many ways. The government prints money to give to the military to spend on things But yet other nations are now doing the same thing because of the same monetary systems that have provided us with such growth. And so now they're like capitalist communist societies. And so, like, what is this level of depth that we're going to here to understand, like, we are not on the same side? Another argument for nationalizing schooling is the technical monopoly. I highlighted as an introduction to the arrangement that perhaps comes closest to being justified, at least for primary and secondary education, is a combination of public and private schools. Parents who choose to send their children to private schools would be paid a sum equal to the estimated cost of educating a child in a public school, provided that at least this sum was spent on education in an approved school. So you can't go to generally not accepted by the public and what's good for the nation schools. Like, you can't just go to basket weaving class for, your K through 8 or like whatever. Like, it's got to be substance. This arrangement would meet the valid features of what the technical monopoly argument is. It would permit competition to develop. This is important. The development and improvement of all schools would thus be stimulated. The injection of competition would do much to promote a healthy variety of schools. Okay, it would also introduce a lot of flexibility into the school systems. You can have a school where the kids go from 8 to 10 in the morning and then 4 to 6 at night, and they don't have homework, but they all graduate to go to great colleges. Then maybe you're onto some new system, and it's competitive and it's progressive and it's great for the kids and it's even greater for society. As it stands now, there is none of that available except through the private education sector. But with a technical monopoly, we could kind of overcome that and really bring a new golden age into education. Again, just a thesis that he has. It is widely urged that the great need in schooling is more money to build more facilities and to pay higher salaries to teachers in order to attract better teachers. This seems a false diagnosis, Friedman writes. The amount of money spent on schooling has been rising at an extraordinarily high rate, far faster than our total income. That's why student debt's being forgiven, is because the government basically used this wartime spending and giving out student loans so that we could do the broken system and just keep perpetuating the cycle. But we are getting so little per dollar spent. It is hard to accept them equally as expenditures on education, and this is equally clear with respect to courses in basket weaving, social dancing, and the other numerous special subjects that do such credit to the ingenuity of education. I hasten to add that there can be no conceivable objection to parents spending their own money on such frills for their kids if they wish. That is their business and the beauty of capitalism. If you want to go to college and take those classes, that's fine if you have the money to do so and not do anything else. Just understand fundamentally the trade off. It would enable parents to buy what they want more efficiently and thereby lead them to spend more than they do now directly and indirectly through taxation. It would be like helpful in preventing parents from being frustrated and spending more money on schools, and there would be less need for conformity in how money is spent, especially for people who don't have children in school, being taxed for children in school. But let's touch on teachers' salaries, to which he pays respect to. Major problem is not that they are too low on the average, they may well be too high on the average, but they are too uniform and rigid. Poor teachers are grossly overpaid, good teachers underpaid, to which I agree. I think that if you were to introduce some form of technical monopoly where the free market was kind of more or less able to flourish itself, then you would be able to have schools where the best and the brightest are the teachers and they're paid for extremely well by the parents, and at the same time providing good for all of society, because all of this information and education is just going to matriculate out at some point. These people are going to write books, they're going to be influencers, they're going to make movies about it. The education needs to be done, and this is just great for everybody. Our problem today is not to enforce conformity, it is rather that we are threatened with an excess of conformity. I think that this is meta in and of itself, that there's this excess of conformity. There's this excess of buck the system, conspiracy theories. Like, there is actually more conformity to linear thinking than we've ever seen before. All right, what does this highlight? Except that the funds would presumably come from the states rather than the federal government. The education of veterans. The adoption of such arrangements would make for effective competition among various types of schools, a more efficient utilization of their resources. It would eliminate the pressure for direct government assistance to private colleges and universities,
and thus preserve their full independence and diversity at the same time. Okay, you can scrutinize for which the subsidies are granted. And so, like, it would have to be at the state level, basically. Like, Ohio's already doing a great job of this, it looks like. And other universities, I'm sure, have followed suit since this writing, this book. Vocational and professional schooling. All I have highlighted. Its function is to raise the economic productivity of the human being. This is why you need both. You need the mental capacity, but you also need to be able to do the utilitarian things. You need to be able to have that utility, right? Like this is not just capitalism or communism. This is utilitarianism. This is what is going to get you through. You have to be able to not subscribe to one economic idea, right? Because like if we just suddenly became the socialist states of America, then like what are you going to do to adapt? And so like one of the things that you can do in order to stay happy is not like ideologically like tie yourself to a certain economic principle, and by focusing on like vocation, professional schooling, trades, and these sorts of things, you are like strengthening the productivity of the human being, and you are a human being. And that transfers no matter what economic system is in place, because these things can change. But this is a great book to remind us why it's important to fight for the things that we believe in. It's our duty to make those sacrifices. If the investment is in a human being, the extra return takes the form of a higher payment for the individual's services than he could otherwise command. In a private market economy, the individual would get his return as his personal income. But if it were subsidized, he would have borne none of the cost. In consequences, if subsidies were given to all who wish to get the training to meet minimum quality standards, there would tend to be an overinvestment in human beings, since individuals would have an incentive to get training so long as it yielded any extra return over private cost. So again, he's just kind of diving into the weeds about redistributing income, and I think that you should demand a higher price for your ability to do whatever it is that you do, to provide value, to provide labor, to provide work to the world, to provide the service to the world. This is great stuff. The individual, I don't know, I have this highlighted, like this payment could easily combine with the payment of income tax and so involve a minimum of additional administrative expense. Anyway, that wraps up chapter 6. Now we go to chapter 7, capitalism and discrimination. I'm just gonna, do the quote here. And the first thing, yeah, he basically says the first sentence is that capitalism has been accompanied by a major reduction in discrimination, whether you're religious, racial, or social, or whatever handicaps. All right. He just calls into comparison, right? Serfs in the Middle Ages, the preservation of Jews through the Middle Ages was possible because of the existence of a market sector in which they could operate and maintain themselves. So, fun fact is like basically this market sector. I can't believe I know this off the rip, off the top of my head, but because Christians believe that lending money with an interest rate attached to it is a sin, the Jews were able to go into the banking system and so essentially create a generational wealth by being forced in not being forced, but like just like by taking the jobs that the Christians wouldn't take. So no, like Rothschild, like he's not a problem. Like you guys just discriminated against his family years ago, and he went into banking and now has like a successful family empire. Like yes, like things are scary when people have money and they become, the patron, right? So once they do become the patron, that's a different question. But like how they got their money, you just got to look at it factually. And you also have to understand though what this is showing is that like people change, and people could change immensely based on what the government is doing, based on what the outcome desired is. Okay, so he says, and I quote directly, it reflected rather a basic belief in private property which was so strong that it overrode the desire to discriminate against anyone, really, just people, especially though people of Milton Friedman's background. Okay. Put the other way, those of us who regard color of skin or religion as irrelevant can buy some things more cheaply as a result, basically, of capitalism. Like you can get it cheaper. Fair employment practices legislation. I didn't highlight much, but I did tab right to work laws, segregation in schooling. He talks about it's like Chicago. He lives in Chicago, and the segregation is probably just as bad there as in southern cities. And that was, that just shows the date of this book. Chapter 8, Monopoly and the Social Responsibility of business and labor. A great chapter. Competition has two very different meanings, he opens the chapter with. In ordinary discourse, competition means personal rivalry. In the economic world, competition means almost the opposite. There is no personal rivalry in the competitive marketplace. There is no personal higgling. The wheat farmer in a free market does not feel himself in personal rivalry with or threatened by his neighbor, who is in fact his competitor. The essence of a competitive market is its impersonal character. No one participant can determine the terms on which other participants shall have access to goods or jobs. That's great. Okay. Monopoly raises two classes of problems for a free society, he says. First, the existence of monopoly means a limitation on voluntary exchange through a reduction in alternatives available to individuals. Second, monopoly raises issues of social responsibility. If you have the monopoly, you can do whatever you want, pay, whatever byproduct, whatever happens, it doesn't matter. You've got the monopoly of something that the market wants. And he just talks about unions here, government and government supported monopoly, kind of breaks down a bunch of these examples, and even talks about like professional licensure, which is going to be in the next chapter. He says, quote, governmentally created and supported monopoly on a state level, which, almost like is true, especially if you've ever had to have professional licensing of any kind. It is it is controlled. I don't know exactly what the monopoly portion of it means for him, but on the state level, it is kind of a monopoly. Like it gets controlled by a few people who are on that board, right? It is very exclusionary in a lot of ways. Appropriate government policy, social responsibility of business and labor, I have highlighted by pursuing his own interest. And this is, I think, probably like what he's leading up to, in fact, of like why capitalism is great, because we're coming to the end of the book now. We've kind of really gotten into the meat and the bones of this whole book. He's really laid out some great analysis and facts and numbers, and then he argues closing that like by pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. Closing with, I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. That was the tail end of a quote by Adam Smith, who I was just talking about in my other book review for Predictably Irrational, or Irrationally Predictable. And Adam Smith is quoted in that as saying, honesty truly is the best policy in business. And that's just like, it's just so true. And I think that like this is why Thor the coder does so well, is because he talks about how he just created game, and that the market was hesitant because of the so-called monopoly that like EA and Blizzard and some of these other major gaming companies have over. And then so people go indie, and when they go independent, they make all these promises but never deliver. And so he was open and honest. And then we're seeing this through guys like Gary Vee. We're seeing this through other influencers like Alex Hormozy, where they're just honest and upfront about what their ask is. And their ask, like in Alex Hormozy's case, is awesome. It's just like, do good, get to this level of business, and then like we're gonna help you get to the next level even more. Like that is my goal here. That is why I'm providing this content for you. And so by pursuing your own interests, you're going to the neighborhood effect, right? Take better care of your family, the interests of your family, what's best for your family, and all of this other stuff. Like it's going to raise everything up, because society is only going to get better. And this is a good thing, and that cannot happen in communism. Socialism is what he. So let's flip through chapter 9, occupational licensure. I'm not going to dive into it because the overall thing is, do we need to be licensed to operate in a free and open market? Not necessarily. However, he does cede to the fact that there does need to be certain oversights, especially for things like healthcare, elder care, and things that do have ramifications. And so now we see that, of course, like with the SEC and the financial industry, insurance and the like. And yes, like even with other trades, plumbing, electrician, things like this need licenses. And I think that's like, I think these are good forms of checks and balances to prevent certain bad actors. And of course, like this is why these things get put in place is because like the bad actors either, if they're poor at providing the service or poor at keeping up their license, or just, however it works out, like there's got to be some form of checks and balances out there to, of course, protect the public. But the other thing that he's arguing here is like, do we really need to have a license to be a taxi cab driver or a hairstylist? We've since seen Lyft and Uber kind of, with the like that whole thing take place, that whole epic anecdotally, right, during the pandemic with my barber, right? Like you go get the service, like, you pay for it. These sorts of things don't really necessarily need to be regulated in what could be a free and open market, because if you have been cutting hair since you were a kid, you don't need to go to school for that and get the, appropriate training. The same thing for lots of things, really. If you can do it and you can get paid well for it, you don't need to be regulated by the government, is what he's saying. He dives into all of that and touches on healthcare, which I think we're going to get to. But what I want to say here is basically like what I highlighted. The explanation is different, that a producer group tends to be more concentrated politically than a consumer group, right? So this happens because physicians, pharmacists, hairstylists, electricians, and plumbers, everybody, once you're in that space, you become sort of, I guess, protective of the space, and you want to do things to keep other competition out. But like almost so much so that like it stresses the system, because every producer is also a consumer. We consume everything, right? Right? We're a consumerist nation. And so because of that, kind of raises these policy issues, which he dives into and talks about the social costs. And then here's medical licensure, talking a little bit more around, the medical council, the AMA, chiropractors, talks about Germany, Austria, so on, and restrictions, just kind of, all of these case studies and everything. And it's a good read. So let's go to chapter 10, the distribution of income, which he's like wrapping it up in a bow. He's coming down to the home stretch of this freaking great read. So we've just got a couple more chapters to go. The distribution of income, willingness to use the arm of the state to promote that as a social goal, right? The first is normative and ethical. What is the justification for state intervention to promote equality? The second is positive and scientific. What has been the effect of the measures actually taken? And so he asks those questions to say, let's dive in and take a look. The ethics of distribution. Lots of pages here setting up what is going to be a fantastic argument, which he then brings into the instrumental role of distribution according to product. I highlighted, but unless an individual receives the whole of what he adds to the product, he will enter into exchanges on the basis of what he can receive rather than what he can produce. So exchanges will not take place that could have been mutually beneficial if the party received what he contributed to the aggregate product. Payment in accordance with products is therefore necessary in order that resources be used more efficiently, at least under a system depending on voluntary cooperation. So he's just like really just like tearing in to the system of communism and socialism, and like it's just ripping it apart. Even the severest internal critics of capitalism have implicitly accepted payment in accordance with product as ethically fair. It's just more ethical to be capitalist. Labor is exploited only if labor is entitled to what it produces, right? But like that's it. So if one accepts instead the socialist premise to each according to his need, from each according to his ability, whatever that may mean, direct quote, it is necessary to compare what labor produces not with what it gets, but with its ability, and to compare what labor gets not with what it produces, but with what it needs. Of course, the Marxist argument is invalid on other grounds as well. There is first the confusion between the total product of all cooperating resources and the amount added to the product. In economic jargon, marginal product. Even more striking, there is an unstated change in the meaning of labor. Okay, he gets into the weeds. Just read it. It's great. Facts of income distribution. This is like the mic drop, the Ben Shapiro of Milton Friedman coming out, letting you know how it is. A capitalist system involving payment in accordance with product can be, and in practice is, characterized by considerable inequality of income and wealth. This fact is frequently misinterpreted to mean that capitalism and free enterprise produce wider inequality than alternative systems, and as a corollary, that the extension and development of capitalism has meant increased inequality. This Misinterpretation is fostered by the misleading character of most published figures on the distribution of income, in particular their failure to distinguish short-run from long-run inequality. One of the most striking facts, which runs counter to many people's expectation, has to do with the sources of income. The more capitalist a country is, the smaller the fraction of income paid for use of what is generally regarded as capital, and the larger fraction paid for human services. In underdeveloped countries like India, Egypt, and so on, something like half of total income is property income. So, so like in the United States, roughly 1/5 is property. The fact that even in this book, capitalist countries are paid for human services is a large fraction. Use this in determining your career. If you're doing something where you're serving others and you're not providing a tangible physical product, you have the ability to, percentage wise, really increase that value. So you're a knowledge worker and a trade worker. The great achievement of capitalism has not been the accumulation of property. It has been the opportunities it has offered to men and women to extend and develop and improve their capacities. You have room for growth. You can go so far, right? You're not hindered. You're not held back. You're not pushed down. You're free to pursue in capitalism and bring others along with you if they want to pursue the same thing. Yet the enemies of capitalism are fond of castigating it as materialist. There is surely drastically less inequality in Western capitalist societies like the Scandinavian countries, France, Britain, and the US than in a status society like India or backward country like Egypt. Comparison with communist countries like Russia is more difficult, and unreliability of evidence. You guys know how I feel about Scandinavian countries. With respect to changes over time, the economic progress achieved in the capitalist societies has been accompanied by a drastic diminution in inequality. So, as late as 1848, John Stuart Mill could write, hitherto, 1848, it is questionable if all the mechanical inventions yet made have lightened the day's toil of any human being. They have enabled a greater population to live the same life of drudgery and imprisonment, and an increased number of manufacturers and others to make fortunes. They have increased the comforts of the middle classes, but they have not yet begun to effect those great changes in human destiny, which it is in their nature and in their futurity to accomplish. This statement was probably not correct even for Mill's day, but certainly no one could write this today about the advanced capitalist countries. It is still true about the rest of the world. The chief characteristic of progress and development over the past century is that it has freed the masses from back-breaking toil and has made available to them products and services that were formerly the monopoly of the upper classes. So it's made available to the masses what was formerly the monopoly of the upper classes. Milton Friedman is a poet, and he didn't even know it. Okay, so anyway, as deep as that is, what he's saying, of course, is that now we have TVs, we have refrigerators, we have all of these amazing amenities. Thank you, capitalism. We're not toiling out all day in the sun. We're not hunting and gathering. And so this is kind of the echo, right? The repetition, the cycle of like now we're in this AI revolution. This is the fourth turning, the fourth industrial revolution. What does this mean for us? What does this mean for humanity? And it's like, okay, what do we have to look forward to? What do we need to be scared of? And my question to you is, how are you going to adapt? All right. Medicine aside, the advances in technology have, for the most part, simply made available to the masses of the people luxuries that were always available in one form or another to the truly wealthy. Modern plumbing, central heating, automobiles, television, radio, just to cite a few examples. We can add so much more to that list: your iPhone, your Android, your internet, anything. Provide conveniences to the masses equivalent to those that the wealthy could always get by the use of servants, entertainers, and so on. Okay, this is like very important. This is like Milton Friedman saying, like, check your privilege, man. Like, this is capitalism. It is privilege. And it's not just privilege for people in the US, it's privilege for everyone. Just other countries aren't doing it. The one kind of inequality is a sign of dynamic change, social mobility, equality of opportunity, the other of a status society. The confusion of these two kinds of inequality is particularly important, Friedman writes, precisely because competitive free enterprise capitalism tends to substitute the one for the other. Non-capitalist societies tend to have wider inequality than capitalists, even as measured by annual income. In addition, inequality in them tends to be permanent, whereas capitalism undermines status and introduces social mobility. Doesn't matter where you came from. How many people came from the dirt only to get to the top, only by responding to the market? Okay, this is key. These are things that need to be studied. Right? The market doesn't demand a guy talking about a book for an hour. The market demands shorts. People at the same economic level pay very different taxes depending on the accident of the source of their income and the opportunities they have to evade the tax. The effect on incentives and the like might well be so serious as to cause a radical loss in the productivity of the society. Tax avoidance may therefore have been essential for economic well being. If so, the gain has been bought at the cost of a great waste of resources and the introduction of widespread inequity. A much lower set of nominal rates plus a more comprehensive base through more equal taxation of all sources of income could be both more progressive in average incidence, more equitable in detail, and less wasteful of resources. It's just talking about the tax system, the income tax, and how we can make it better for everybody. These taxes are much less taxes on being wealthy than on becoming wealthy. They impede even more strikingly so far as they are effective the accumulation of wealth. We're now in a tax system, and he does a great job of breaking this down in the book. That's why you need to read it, of like why we got there. The rich people did the same thing the union people did. Like they got there, they got all their buddies to pass the laws. Now they're staying rich and made it hard for everyone to get there. And this is backwards. We now have blue ocean strategy. We have all of this stuff that shows Milton Friedman, the liberal himself, saying there is prosperity for all, and it is only through competition in the free and open market to get there. That's why we cite Adam Smith. Like, the only way forward in business is honesty, being open and being honest. It's the only way to make this happen. And so what are we waiting for, right? So if it's a tax on getting wealthy and not a tax on the wealthy itself, what are you guys doing? What are you revolting against? Like, what, like, on the left and the right, like what are you thinking? Because if it is truly something that is government based, then what do we need to worry about more, the government or the capitalist system? And this is what he's saying: it's the government, not the system. I find it hard, as a liberal, Friedman writes, to see any justification for graduated taxation solely to redistribute income. This seems a clear case of using coercion to take from some in order to give to others, and thus to conflict head on with individual freedom. Mic drop. Boom. Yet it would avoid a situation where there any large numbers could vote to impose on other taxes that did not also affect their own tax burden. Very important. Such a flat rate, even with no change whatsoever in other features of the law, would yield a higher revenue because a larger amount of taxable income would be reported for three reasons. This is why flat tax is important. There are no tax avoidance reasons at all, right? So then you don't have debates like Trump saying, like, she knows about the tax laws because she used them. We all use them. We're rich. Like, so this is like exactly what Trump points out. Okay. Here are the three reasons. There would be less incentive than now to adopt legal but costly schemes that reduce the amount of taxable income reported. This is the tax avoidance. Okay. So tax avoidance would go away. There would be less incentive to fail to report income that legally should be reported. Tax evasion. The removal of the disincentive effects of the present structure of rates would produce a more efficient use of present resources and a higher income. If you're going to tax us, at least do it right, government. If the yield of the present highly graduated rates is so low, so also must be their redistributive effects. This does not mean they do no harm. On the contrary, the yield is so low partly because some of the most competent men in the country devote their energies to devising ways to keep it so low, and because many other men shape their activities with one eye on tax effects. All of this sheer waste. And so this is why it's so much of a imposed chain to say, well, I don't want to work this overtime, or I don't want to get into this tax bracket because I'm going to be taxed more. It is meant to confuse you. It is meant to hold you down and meant to make you the wage slave that so many of us are. It's because the system got put into place, has been built upon, and is now so oppressive. So we're on chapter 11, social welfare measures. He talks about public housing. In fact, insofar as minimum wage laws, they have any effect at all, their effect is clearly to increase poverty, Milton writes. The effect of the minimum wage is therefore to make unemployment higher than it otherwise would be. The people who are rendered unemployed are precisely those who can least afford to give up the income they have been receiving. Essentially, he's saying that the higher minimum wage makes it so that the people hiring have to, by default, have higher standards. Because if you're forced to pay someone more, you have to make sure they're more qualified. And you get all of these people who like, so it just keeps people poor because nobody is no longer qualified to flip burgers unless you also can flip burgers, run the cash register, run the window, and mop the floor, and close, and do the accounting for the previous day, and make sure all of the stuff is done. And don't forget to clean the bathrooms on the way out. Now you're definitely earning $15 an hour minimum wage. But if you can only do a quarter of that because you're just somehow handicapped for whatever reason, mentally or physically, it's going to be a harder call for the person to hire you. And so, while there might be a role for you at less money per hour, for less responsibility per hour, the imposed enforced minimum wage prevents that from playing out into providing more jobs. Essentially, like if minimum wage laws didn't exist, you could hire two people for $7.50 to do the job of one person that one person could do for 15. But now you're forced to find the one person who can do the $15 an hour job instead of paying two, three, four separate people lower, maybe overall more, but more balanced. Anyway, I hope you get what I'm saying. And I think that was just an important thing. Old age and survivorship insurance I have tabbed. I mean, we've all got to self support, is what he says, and that's fine. Just make the education there. Like I've done it. I have to do it, and I have done so with my portfolio, and I've been very successful, and highly recommend it. Like I would rather not have any of the money in my Social Security, and I would rather have all of it under my own purview and control. Chapter 12: The Alleviation of Poverty. Milton Friedman opens up with, "I am distressed by the sight of poverty. I am benefited by its alleviation. The neighborhood effect." Okay, everybody hates poverty. We all benefit if it goes away. So, how do we make that happen? And what are we doing not? And all of that. And he dives into it in beautiful detail. And we're going to wrap up this chapter with one thing that I have been on a tirade on my social media about: liberalism and egalitarianism. The liberal will therefore distinguish sharply between equality of rights and equality of opportunity. On the one hand, and material equality or equality of outcome on the other. He may welcome the fact that a free society in fact tends toward greater material equality than any other yet tried, but he will regard this as a desirable byproduct of a free society, not its major justification. He will welcome measures that promote both freedom and equality, such as measures to eliminate monopoly power and to improve the operation of the market. He will regard private charity directed at helping the less fortunate as an example of the proper use of freedom. He may approve state action towards ameliorating poverty as a more effective way in which the great bulk of the community can achieve a common objective. He will do so with regret, however, at having to substitute compulsory for voluntary action. It is regretful, it is sad that we as a people have to rely on the government to enforce making sure that poverty is not there. We do that with regret because we know that it is a necessary thing that has to happen, and we have to do our best. But at what expense? The egalitarian will go this far too, but he will want to go further. He will defend taking from some to give to others, not as a more effective means whereby the some can achieve an objective they want to achieve, but on grounds of justice. This is his word, justice. Like he says, but on the grounds of justice, not what they need. At this point, equality comes sharply into conflict with freedom. One must choose. One cannot both be an egalitarian in this sense and a liberal. And so I think it's time for many of you to make the decision: are you an egalitarian or are you a liberal? If you're doing anything for social justice of any kind, you're an egalitarian. The liberal, as defined by Friedman, a radical by the WEF, lays out what it means to be a liberal, which I think is the best version of being a liberal and why I consider myself a JFK Democrat, right? A liberal by many means, many means, but a conservative in today's day and age. Chapter 13, conclusion. Okay, this thing is this highlighted, marked, and underlined, boxed, and everything. And I've got 3 tabs. So the conclusion, obviously glorious by Friedman. And I wrote still, it's like I've got writing, underline, everything. In the 1920s and 1930s, intellectuals in the US were overwhelmingly persuaded that capitalism was a defective system inhibiting economic well-being and thereby freedom, and that the hope for the future lay in a greater measure of deliberate control by political authorities over economic affairs. The actual was compared with the idea. I highlighted technology, free from the pressure of special interest groups. We can compare the actual with the actual. If we do so, the clear difference is undoubtedly the actual effects of government intervention and their intended effects. He wrote Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Who today can regard the chains of proletarians in the Soviet Union as weaker than the chains of the proletarians in the US, or Britain, or France, or Germany, or any Western state? Let us look closer to home, which of any of the great reforms of the past decades have achieved its objectives. Monetary reforms intended to promote stability in economic activities and prices exacerbated inflation during and after World War I and fostered a higher degree of instability. The monetary authorities established bare primary responsibility for converting a serious economic contraction into the catastrophe of the Great Depression. A system established largely to prevent bank panics produced the most severe banking panic in American history. Then tabbed an agricultural program intended to help impecunious farmers and to remove what were alleged to be basic dislocations in the organization of agriculture has become a national scandal that has wasted public funds, distorted the use of resources, riveted increasingly heavily and detailed controls on farmers, interfered seriously with U.S. foreign policy, and withal has done little to help the impecunious farmer. A housing program intended to improve the housing conditions of the poor, to reduce juvenile delinquency, and to contribute to the removal of urban slums has worsened the housing conditions of the poor, contributed to juvenile delinquency, and spread urban blight. And so he points out all of this stuff. Government intervention has wreaked havoc. What is the answer? We turn to Adam Smith and the true liberal. The greater part of the new ventures undertaken by government in the past few decades have failed to achieve their objectives, Friedman writes. All this has been the product of the initiative and drive of individuals cooperating through the free market. We have been able to afford and surmount these measures only because of the extraordinary fecundity of the market. The invisible hand has been more potent for progress than the visible hand for retrogression. It's just beautiful writing. They seek to resolve what is supposedly a conflict of interest or a difference in view about interest, not by establishing a framework that will eliminate the conflict, right? The logical thing to do, or by persuading people to have different interests, but by forcing people to act against their own interest. They substitute the values of outsiders for the values of participants, either some telling others what is good for them or the government taking from some to benefit others. These measures are therefore countered by one of the strongest and most creative forces known to man, the attempt by millions of individuals to promote their own interest, to live their lives by their own values. This is the major reason why the measures have so often had the opposite effects of the intended. It is also one of the major strengths of a free society, and explain why government regulation does not strangle it. Society is free. We are not beholden to one government. We are all people of this world. As Adam Smith once said, my last highlight, his closing paragraph, there is much ruin in a nation. Our basic structure of values and the interwoven network of free institutions will withstand much. I believe that we shall be able to preserve and extend freedom despite the size of the military programs and despite the economic powers already concentrated in Washington. But we shall be able to do so only if we awake to the threat that we face, only if we persuade our fellow men that free institutions offer a surer, even if at times slower, route to the ends that they seek over the coercive power of the state. And I didn't highlight this, but the glimmerings of change that are already apparent in the intellectual climate are a hopeful augury. He's hopeful. He's hopeful for the future. But the thing is the threat is still there. I hope you found that wildly as fascinating as I found it. And I want to hear your comments on what you think about the education system that he proposes. And I want to hear what you think about, is he a liberal? Have things changed that much? Is he able to classify himself as a liberal as he does? Or are you going to define him as something else like the WEF does? I want to hear your thoughts on that. And let me know if you enjoyed this, and we'll see you guys on the next one.